Welcome to a special Father's Day episode of the Joni and Friends Ministry podcast. I'm Crystal Keating, and I love sharing hopeful stories of people impacted by disability each week and answering your questions about how to welcome families with special needs in your church and community. If you have a question or are interested in any of the resources mentioned on the podcast, please visit joniandfriends.org/podcast to send me a message. Well, this week I have the privilege of sitting down with Doug Mazza, a father who served as president and COO of Joni and Friends for 20 years. Prior to ministry work, Doug had been a driven and very successful businessman in the automotive industry. That is, until the trajectory of his life changed when Ryan, his third son, was born with profound physical and intellectual disabilities. With this unexpected reality, Doug walked through loss of identity and a time of confusion for his family.
What I thought was tragedy in my life, God answered a question that I had, which was, what use could Ryan's life possibly have? He not only showed me the purpose for Ryan's life, he showed me the purpose for mine. And I asked him to save my son Ryan's life, and he saved me.
Today, Doug shares how God gave him a better identity than what he had chosen for himself, and where he found courage to step up and be the dad he was called to be. Doug Mazza is the loving father of a son who was born with profound physical and intellectual disabilities. He's the former president and chief operating officer of Joni and Friends, and he's also a man who never misses a moment to speak life-giving words of encouragement to others. That's why I'm so honored to be sitting down to speak with him right now. Doug, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to be with you today.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Honored to be asked, Crystal. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor to sit with you, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. And Doug, I have to say it's been an absolute joy for me to serve under your leadership as you were president of Joni and Friends for 20 years. I just can't believe it. That is a legacy that you've left for us.
Well, thank you very much. I decided 20 years of Doug Mazza is enough for anybody, and it's time for someone else to take that seat. But it was the most joyful, and as it relates to our topic today, healing time for me. In that what I thought was tragedy in my life, God answered a question that I had, which was, what use could Ryan's life possibly have?
Absolutely.
And he not only showed me the purpose for Ryan's life, he showed me the purpose for mine, which was to be at Joni and Friends. And I asked him to save my son Ryan's life, and he saved me. So I owe Ryan everything, and Joni and Friends as well. It's been 20 glorious years of healing. I mean, who gets to sit alongside Joni Eareckson Tada for 20 years and asking God to show you some purpose in your disabled son's life? And he said, well, how about if you sit alongside Joni Eareckson Tada for 20 years with that help?
She is so amazing. Oh, and you two together, just all that God's done in and through you. And you know, I've only really known you as a man in the ministry and as Ryan's father, but I know that you are a highly successful businessman long before God called you here to reach out to people with disabilities. Doug, I'd love to hear what life was like before you came to Joni and Friends. And I'd also love to hear if you could share your vision and passion for living in those early days. What got you out of bed in the morning before you came to the ministry?
Well, I graduated from college and went into the service like a lot of people did back in those days when we had a war going on. And I didn't do anything important there, but I did serve, and I'm glad I did. I came out kind of a driven man, and I had always wanted to be in business. But I wanted specifically to be in leadership. I wanted to be in management. And I was a driven man, probably in an unhealthy way. I just put tons and tons of energy into my career. And along the way, I had, Ryan was born. He was the third son of three. He was born with profound disabilities. I was in the delivery room when he was born. We did not know that he was going to have special needs, and it was evident immediately. His head was severely deformed. The sutures in his head were fused together as a fetus. The forehead, however, was not connected, and so if you can picture this, Ryan's brain grew in front of his face. It pushed forward through the forehead and was encased in front of his face. It pushed his eyes out of the socket. It twisted his thumbs and toes, and it was quite a sight to behold. The doctor had never seen anything like this, and he just took Ryan and turned away from me so that I didn't have to see him and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't see how this child can live but a few hours." But at 2 weeks, Ryan had his first craniofacial advancement, which is an operation to restructure his head. The disease continued to ravage after he was born. He had 13 brain surgeries after he was born in the first 3 years of life. And it was catastrophic for us at the time.
So here you were, you're a successful businessman, and Ryan comes into your world. What were some of the things that you were asking God in the moment? What were you feeling? What was your family life like?
Well, there was confusion. I was living for myself at that time. I believed in God. I believed Jesus was the Son of God. I had not been raised nor educated theologically in the idea of born again. I did not know what my friends were talking about when they talked about that. But I believed Jesus was the Son of God, and God was doing whatever he did in the universe, but it didn't have a lot to do with me. I was really working in my own strength. And the world was giving me some pretty good feedback. I was having a success in my career. I had taken some leadership roles that were significant. I, in my background, have been the senior American executive in 2 multinational corporations in the United States. And so the world was giving me feedback that my process of being in charge.
Right, you were doing something right.
It was, hey, just keep doing what you're doing.
Right.
And then you get something that you have no control over. You have no ability to fix this, heal it, or make it better, and it just continues to spiral out of control. It was a very, very confusing time. And so that was when I began turning to God. I'm a curious person. Probably the best decision I made was I didn't get angry at God. I got curious. And so I opened my Bible for the first time in 40 years, in my late, or at least my late 30s, I suppose. And I opened the Bible and wanted to find out what God had to say about Ryan. Turns out that God has a lot to say, especially Jesus has a lot to say about people with disabilities, their
Yes, he
importance,
does.
God's sovereignty, and that we are all made in his image.
Now, when you were going through this time of seeking God and asking questions, did you have any men coming alongside of you at that time?
Not really, because I didn't have any Christian friends per se. I had secular friends. I found that my friends didn't know what to say to me, number one. Our family was kind of the odd man out. We really didn't fit socially as people were getting together, in your 30s and early 40s and talking about your children's soccer games and all of those things. And I had 2 other children that were doing really quite well, but our life was upside down because of Ryan, and it was upside down for our other children as well. And so it was a very confusing time. I would say that the biggest reaction I got from my friends was I interpreted their response to me as, "I'm glad I'm not you."
Oh, that's painful.
And that was really there. They didn't know really what to say. If you're not focused on Christ, if you're doing it all in your own strength, then all other people have to offer you is their own strength.
That is
if you're
so
not hanging
true.
around with Christians. Now, if you are hanging around with other men and women of faith, they can put their arm around you. They can have much more compassion, and they can help you seek answers even if they don't have them. But I don't know what people who don't have the Lord do in this situation, but I know I tried it, and it didn't work out at all.
No, community is so important because that's how the body of Christ can come together to support and encourage one another. That's how we speak God's word into one another's life.
Yes.
And that's what I see in you. And so I know that God's done an incredible work these past, 42 years. Is Ryan 42? Is that right?
He's 42 years old, miraculously. He wasn't supposed to live very long. And,
incredible.
And God has extended his days, and he is my senior partner in ministry. I give him all the credit. He's the one who did the suffering. He's the one that God said, my grace is sufficient for you. He said that to both of us, but I think when you're the one that has gone through the level of physical pain and suffering as Ryan has, and then God shows you the purpose for all of that, it is an extraordinary moment when you realize my life would be less rich without Ryan. The world would be less rich without Ryan. All the things that we have done together at Joni and Friends, every thought that I've had, every motivation to come to work and to be in disability ministry at all has been because he was born.
Now, Doug, how did you come to Joni and Friends? You were here 20 years, but what happened in between Ryan's birth and you getting here? I've got to hear this story.
Yes. Sometimes I give my testimony and it sounds like it takes a week, between, okay, so he was born and then we suffered and then I gave this prayer and then I'm the president of Joni and Friends. It didn't exactly happen that way. As the years went on, I began, along with my wife, Lorraine. Lorraine is actually the one who brought me back to church. It was an evangelical church. I had never experienced that before. I came from a religion that was much more formalized, a lot of repetition of prayer and so on. And a good 10-minute sermon was what we looked for in the church that I had attended. And she brought me to her church, and this pastor, I listened to him. I only listened to him 3 times because religion was not a problem. I had religion. What I didn't have was a relationship. What I didn't have was a relationship with Jesus Christ. Yeah. And he explained it, and I went 3 times, and I bought it completely. I understood it. I thought, why didn't somebody tell me that last piece, that I can have a personal relationship with God? So I began to pray differently. And, of course, it was immature prayers in the beginning. We start off with milk as babies, as believers. And it took a long time before I got to eat any meat. But it got me back into the Bible. I say it got me back into the Bible like I'd been in there before. It got me into the Bible.
There you go.
And I began reading what Jesus had to say, what the Bible had to say about people with disabilities. And that was very encouraging to me. I remember reading 1 Corinthians 10:13 for the first time. You have to picture a father in great distress, reaching out, grasping at whatever straws the Bible could give me, whatever encouragement I could get. And I get to 1 Corinthians 10:13, which basically is telling me, I'm not going to give you more than you can endure. And I thought, that's it? That's the deal? You're not going to give me more than I can endure? That's not what I'm looking for.
Oh, yeah.
But you know what I have found over the years, and this is the result of stick-to-itiveness and reading the whole Bible and experiencing life as Christ would have us live it to the best of my ability, is that I believe that anyone who is suffering, that hears my voice or knows someone who is suffering, that with faith, God is not going to bring you more than you can endure. You may think so. You may think, Lord, I am past my limit. But if you maintain your faith through that suffering, that it lights the fuse to Romans 8:28. That's what we really want, is Romans 8:28, where it says, all things work together for the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. A lot of people like to quote Romans 8:28, all things work together for the good. We can look around the world and see that things don't work out for the good.
Certainly.
But people that are people of faith, that pour their heart into trusting God through 1 Corinthians 10:13, Lord, I'm going to trust you. It is painful. It is all I can tolerate right now. But I am going to continue to trust that you have a plan for my life. When people commit to that, 100% of the time, there is a Romans 8:28 ending for them.
Amen.
That all things will work together for the good in God's plan for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And that's how you get that. And I have watched that over 20 years, not only in my own life, but as I look around the world at where Joni and Friends has been. I've been to the plains of Africa, the mountains of Ecuador, the slums of China, and every place in between. I have watched 1 Corinthians 10:13 suffering turn into a Romans 8:28 experience for those who endure it. And wasn't that Christ's message? Without Christ's suffering, we don't have much of an opportunity to get to a resurrection and life eternal.
That's right. I love what you said about really the hope at the end of the tunnel is the Romans 8:28. That is the light. That is the hope. And, as I think about people who are really struggling in their suffering, some of them are really struggling with their identity. They're pulled towards the world. And so many of us are tempted to find our identity in our careers, our abilities, the level of power and authority we have, our possessions. You really talked a lot about this, especially in your book, Another Kind of Courage, when you're speaking to fathers of children affected by disability, as this is changing my identity, and I'm not sure that I can really go with it. I'm not comfortable with it. So how did God transform your identity as a person changed by being Ryan's father?
It was radical. I mean, if you think about a driven man on a corporate path, I think I identified it as somebody sticking a stick in the spokes of your bike as you're speeding up a hill to where you want to get, and all of a sudden you're over the handlebars. In my particular case, I was a man who found his identity in his work, in his career. Yes, I was a father, and I love my family, and I love my children.
Absolutely.
And even found time to coach their little soccer team. But my identity was in my career that I was building at the time. And when you have a tragedy like this come into your life, it interrupts your flow. It interrupts your personal strategic plan. It interrupts the plan you made for your life. And to be told that God has a different plan for you and that this is part of it is not comforting at the time.
Right.
You want to get back on track. You want this to go away. And unfortunately, there have been too many examples of fathers that have walked away from their families because it was the only way they could figure out to get their identity back. When in fact, what I found was that God really actually had a better identity for me than the one that I had chosen. The world was telling me that you've chosen well, and only a few people will get to do what you're doing. But what he eventually gave me to do, and working with the Lord, and working with Joni Eareckson Tada, and working for the Lord, and traveling the world, were experiences, oh my Lord, it is so humbling that I might have missed that. Now, for all the fathers out there, you're probably not going to have someone knock on your door and ask you to go to Africa at the end of this podcast. But you are going to see the world differently, with different opportunities and different priorities, that I believe at the end of your life, you're going to be glad that you took that path, the path less traveled. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be successful. God needs actually more men and women in business who are Christians. If you think about the economic crises we've had, the banking failures and so on, would they be so bad if all the banking heads were having a devotion in the morning together? I don't know. I'd like to think, having been a businessman near that level, that things would not have been the same, and the decisions that would have been made corporately would have affected this country in a different way. And so you have to take that from that global perspective down into your family's culture.
Absolutely.
And what culture do I want for my family? You can get lost in saying, I'm working this hard for my family. It's all for my family.
That's a good point. It's easy to get deceived when we're doing good and noble things that people are praising.
Yes, and it's a protective wall to stand behind, but it's thin. It's thin. Yes.
God has a way of uncovering those things to
Yes.
us and to others as well.
It's true. And I would say, be as driven as you can balance. Be as successful in the world as you can balance, because the word success and the world are really, at the end of your life, oxymorons. And if you can balance those two things and be a corporate head and be the father of a disabled child or several, and have served the Lord in every possible way that he wanted you to and intended your life for, then God bless you. I think you should. But I think that most of us have tough decisions to make. And the first is accepting that this is the child God gave me. And that this child belongs to him, and I've been entrusted with that child. I believe that a believer will say, that means God has a better plan for me. And we need to find out what that plan is. And again, it doesn't mean fathers need to quit their jobs and stay home 24 hours or even change their pathway. But we need to get real about what God's plan is for our lives and not just put up a wall that says, I'm working this hard for my family and you can take care of our disabled child and I'll go out and make the money and be isolated from all of this. I would say that the crossover for me was making myself available because I didn't think I had anything to give. I thought that ministry was something I was to receive. Then I realized, well, maybe God can use this somehow. Wouldn't that be great if God could actually use this? And when I got to that point, I just made myself available. Had no idea I would ever be with a wonderful ministry like Joni and Friends, no less be its president. I was just thinking maybe there's a place I could go and work in respite somewhere for 3 hours and help someone. I didn't. But when you make yourself available, God is going to use your crafting. He's going to take your crafting and say, I was wondering when you were going to invite me into this thing. Now let's see what we can do. And you really have no idea.
Doug, in your 20 years here at Joni and Friends, I can only imagine the countless fathers that you've spoken with through the years and frankly just been a great encouragement to. I'm sure you've talked to so many fathers of children with disabilities who've been feeling weary, trapped, out of control, even ready to throw in the towel. Do any significant conversations come to mind? I mean, what were those fathers struggling with and what was particularly encouraging to them?
Well, of course, there have been. I've met literally thousands of parents and fathers over the years. And I think there's two categories. One is that sometimes the best thing we can do is to be with people that are suffering without speaking. I think of Job. He had his friends come with the best of intentions, and they were doing wonderfully until they opened their mouth. And they were not encouraging to poor Job at all.
No, they were confusing.
They confused him and they challenged him. And I think that when they left, he felt more alone than before. And they wanted to do the best thing. I have found that some of the most comforting times have been when close friends, especially believers, have come and sat down alongside of me in an emergency room or when I was in intensive care with Ryan, and just come and sit with me. Just put their arm around me, let me know that they're there with me, and just spend some time and not feel alone, feel like you've got somebody with you. And then there comes the time when it is ready to speak, when you need to encourage people. And I think that encouragement has become a real cornerstone for me. I know how much encouragement meant to me, and I believe the world is crying out for encouragement. We need to encourage one another genuinely where encouragement is due and needed. I'm not talking about participation trophies. I'm talking about...
Right, no platitudes.
No platitudes, but just letting people know that they're not alone, that there are answers, and that as they begin to ask them, that you can help people walk through them. I've had, especially at Joni and Friends family retreats over the years, I think of all of the dads groups I've participated in and some of the things that they have said. It's very hard to get a group of dads talking in a circle about the difficulties that they're going through in their marriage or what they're feeling. But I've also found that once they start talking, you can't get them stopped. And it is like a gusher because it is often pent up and they have not shared it with others. So my first suggestion is don't let that be you. You do need to find somebody to speak to. You need to find your pastor. You need to have a best friend. I know that you have your wife and your family, but they're going through the same thing you're going through. And you need somebody that can relate to you, that's a listener, that's not going to be judgmental. And I think that is the greatest of therapies, is to be loved. It's just to be loved. And I mean by a close friend, the love of a friend that has compassion for you. almost every year that I was at family retreat, during one of those groups, a dad would come up to me and say, and this is a general statement that fits so many people that I spoke to, after being here at Respite for 5 days at Joni and Friends with my family, I've begun to see my child in a different light. And I think that if I can do another 359 days and come back here, I can do another year with my family. I've met so many men that have been at family retreat. They've been talked into going as a last effort and left with courage to step up and be the dad that they're supposed to be and see their child as the gift that he is. I remember with tears in my eyes realizing one day after being a developing Christian, a maturing Christian for several years after I came to Christ, holding Ryan in my arms, he was much younger, and on that day seeing him as a gift from God for the first time. And what we need to do is get to that point because the gift is right in front of you. The gift of your child and what they have to give to you and what you can learn from them is missed if you walk away from it. It is on the way. It is, again, we talked about 1 Corinthians 10:13. It is sometimes hard to endure, but for those who endure, the gift is coming, I promise you.
Amen. Well, Doug, you talk about finding courage, and I think that's what a lot of men need. That really relates to the church, and I think of the men who maybe are part of a church but not really connected, and you talked about the beauty of coming together as men, and albeit slow, opening up, but then the floodgates come where men really feel empowered and feel like, I can do this again. So on that note, what are some practical ways churches and communities can better support fathers whose lives are impacted by disability?
What we have found at Joni and Friends, as we work with churches all over the world, that seminaries and Bible colleges are not preparing your pastor in the area of special needs. There is virtually no training in seminary that we have been able to find that specifically directs itself to, now when you are starting a church, this is the ministry that you have for people with special needs. And so Joni and Friends has begun that course, and we are teaching it in everything from a certificate to a master's degree in conjunction with some wonderful universities that have taken that on, and it is also a virtual class as well. But the reason I mention that and the reason we put so much emphasis on it is I, as a dad who did not go to seminary, I came from the secular world before I was in ministry, thought my pastor should have had much more compassion for me.
Right.
I did not feel welcomed in the particular church that I had been attending. And it was almost like, we really don't have anything for you here. And when I came to Joni and Friends, we had 11 pastors on staff at the time that I came, and I asked them if they would bring to me anything they had in their material from when they were in school about special needs and suffering. And they looked around the table at me and said, we don't have to go home and get anything. We don't have anything.
Oh, man.
And so have compassion for your pastor. He hasn't had any training in your specific examples except through his life and, of course, through the wonderful training he's had in understanding theology. But when it comes to special needs, to answer your question most specifically, what can my church do next week? I can tell you that the number one thing people with disability, families with disability are looking for, if you want to really help an entire family, is respite. You can have a church that will give 3 or 4 hours in the evening a month. A month. Not even, I'm not talking about every day or even every week. I remember having a 4-hour respite on a Saturday after 24/7 of a child who was deathly ill, and I use that in the literal term, and being given 4 hours of having someone come in and take over and let me have a breather, and my family a breather, and my wife a breather. It was the equivalent of a 2-week vacation. And if we can get a coalition of churches, if you can get 4 churches in a community, there's a lot of churches in your community. If you can get 4 churches to do one night of respite so that there is a spreading of the burden, if you will, that you're going to find is not a burden at all, but rather a great opportunity to serve the Lord, to bring new people to your church, and to expand the mission and purpose of why the church exists.
Absolutely.
After all, it was Jesus Christ's idea, not mine, not Joni and friends. It was Jesus who said with a human mouth those holy words in Luke 14:21 and 23. He instructed us, go quickly to the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor and the lame and the blind. And then in verse 23, he repeated himself, something Jesus didn't do very often. And he said, go out to the roads and the country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. So what Jesus was telling us is that his house, his church, his bride is not complete until we in church hear the tapping of the red-tip cane, the singing of the developmentally disabled voice, and the hum of the wheelchair. Then God smiles on the church. Then God says, my house is full. My house is complete as I intended it to be.
Amen. Doug, as we close our time together, would you like to share any last words of hope and wisdom to fathers and mothers who are listening today?
God loves your family member with a disability. He was not surprised. We may be shocked, but God was not surprised. And I believe that the suffering that Jesus had on the cross was our example that speaks to me and says, you're never going to understand the purpose of suffering. So allow me to demonstrate it for you. Allow me to hang on this cross and show you that even my son will suffer. He will show you the example of mental suffering, of physical suffering, and even death. But most of all, he's going to defeat it. And he's defeating it for you. He's defeating it for your disabled family member. He's defeating it for all of the suffering you are going through, the pain, the tears, and all of that. And he's going to redeem it.
That is some hopeful words. Doug, I'm so thankful for your time. Thank you for coming, especially up here just to talk with us today. I'm so grateful for your leadership, for your life, and for your courage to stand with the Lord.
You're very kind. I love being here, and God bless everyone who has taken time to listen to this podcast. I hope it was helpful.
No father is ever prepared to hear that his child will be born with a disability. And just like Doug, many parents will walk through a season of confusion or experience a loss of identity. But just as God showed Doug purpose in his son's life, there is purpose for your family as well. As Doug shared, God has a lot to say about people with disabilities. We are all made in his image, and he is sovereign. And with faith, God will not bring you more than you can endure. He will work all things together for the good of those who love him. If you'd like to read more from Doug, please visit joniandfriends.org/podcast to download a free chapter of his book, Another Kind of Courage. This book was written with Steve Bundy, another father impacted by disability, and shares God's design for fathers who are looking for hope and courage. This is a great read for fathers, but really, any member of the family who would like to learn a father's heart when it comes to disability. And when you visit joniandfriends.org/podcast, you can also learn more about family retreats and sign up for a week of respite and encouragement for your family. Or you can apply to volunteer and serve a family impacted by disability in desperate need of refreshment. Thank you for listening today, and join me again next week as we hear from Dennis Spivey and Jessica Johnson, two typical siblings who are sharing their experiences growing up in a family impacted by disability. I'm your host, Crystal Keating, and thank you again for listening to the Joni and Friends Ministry Podcast.